Okay, we're going to get started, everyone. Please feel free to move forward if you would like to. Thank you, Janan. Thank you, Hanin. We're using these mics because there are people joining us online, and this is the way that they will hear us and also your questions. So if you ask questions, please wait so we can bring the microphone to you. So my name is Erin Pettigrew. I teach in the History and Arab Crossroads Studies programs, and I'm also a co-PI on the Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World, which has organized today's workshop or discussion. And we've been doing this for the last 5 years, I believe. 5 years in that there has been a long-standing publication research that used to primarily be framed from dissertation to book. And we've been, I think, slowly moving to a more general discussion about writing and publication. And then the really big shift that happened 3 years ago is that we decided to include, aside from an acquisitions editor from an important publishing house, academic publishing house, we've included developmental editors. So this year, I'm joined by Niels Hooper from the University of California Press, and then Marissa Mika, who's here as our developmental editor. And I'll explain why we decided to go in that direction. The hope is that you'll come away from this panel discussion today with really practical advice about writing generally, about writing a book proposal, approaching editors, signing a first contract, and navigating the peer review and publication process. And I think that that's something that all of us still, it's always helpful to hear advice about that, no matter what stage we're at in our careers and no matter how many books or articles we've published. We really want to demystify this process, which is partly why we invited Marissa as a developmental editor to discuss how this kind of editor, a developmental editor, might be able to fill what is often a gap between our initial ideas and approaching an acquisitions editor. I have to say, one of the reasons that I encouraged us to think about inviting a developmental editor a few years ago is that developmental editors were something that were mentioned to me only very late in my own revision process for my first book, when I was really struggling with responding to reviewer comments. And I knew about copy editors, but not developmental editors. And in hiring someone at the time to help me think about how best to revise my manuscript, I mean, at that point, I already had reader reports, and they said the book should be published, but the reports had so many changes that needed to happen. It felt really overwhelming. I really came to see how not only how many skilled editors exist, because I went on a freelance editor's website. You probably know of this website, and I had over 100 responses, which was overwhelming in its own way. But how valuable developmental editing can be at a certain stage of the writing and restructuring process. And I also came to see how many scholars secretly rely on developmental editors without openly acknowledging it. And I was talking with Marissa about this last night. I feel like that's shifting, but I don't know if it's just because I talk about it openly, and that helps encourage other conversations. I had attended several workshops just like this and understood what acquisitions editors wanted, and had gotten my book to the stage of review and revisions. But I was still struggling with how to get it to that last stage. And I think for those of you who already have or will meet with Marissa, you see that much of what she does is also to function as a kind of publication coach, not only for your intellectual ideas, but also for your writing practice. So I'm just explaining why we've had this sort of two-part event. So I want to introduce both of our invited editors today, who both came all the way from the Bay Area in California. Alex just said it's because California is just the best. I said yes. But it's definitely made me all kinds of nostalgic for my own previous life there. So first I'll introduce Niels Hooper, who's trained as a historian and has almost 30 years of experience in publishing. He began his career at Verso Books And he's now been at the University of California Press for 20 years and is currently executive editor of the History, Middle East Studies, and World History lists. He is driven by a strong awareness of histories of social injustice and a desire to learn from historic struggles to overcome them. And as such, has cultivated a list that interrogates power and questions to explore past possibilities for a more just society. Several of our former HRF fellows and currently faculty have published with UC Press. Niels has specifically worked with Gunja Sengupta and Awam Amka on their recently published, and I'm sorry, I look like I have a scroll, but I accidentally published this on, or printed this on poster paper and didn't want to waste anything. So they're recently published Sojourners, Sultans, and Slaves, America and the Indian Ocean in the Age of Abolition and Empire, as well as our own Rana Al-Motawa's Everyday Life in the Spectacular City, Making Home in Dubai, and then forthcoming books by HRF fellows Esmat Al-Halabi, a previous book by Chris Lowe, and then the forthcoming book by Barak Sayem. There's an echo here that is distracting. Marissa Mika has an MHS in International Health from Johns Hopkins and a PhD in History and Sociology of Science from UPenn. She's the author of a wonderful book, Africanizing Oncology, Creativity, Crisis, and Cancer in Uganda, which was published with Ohio University Press and was a finalist for both the African Studies Association Best Book Prize and the Bethwell A. Ogot Prize for Best Book in East African Studies. Between 2016 and 18, she held a Wellcome Trust postdoc fellowship on chronic disease in Africa at the University College London. In 2019, she served as the founding director of the Medical Humanities program at the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. And she now works as a developmental editor, a writer, and a yogi in Berkeley. And I have to say, I suggested that we invite Marissa here for this workshop because we were a part of a dissertation writing group together when we were both PhD students in Oakland in California. And I know firsthand what a brilliant thinker, writer, and critic she is. And I thought we could all benefit from hearing her insights on writing. So thank you both, Niels and Marissa, for being here. They both have done sessions like this. I think Niels especially has done a lot. So I have some questions that I'm going to ask, but I know they both have their own particular things they would like to say. So feel free to sort of jump off from my questions and go in the directions you want. We'll talk for about half an hour and then we'll open things up for questions from everyone else. So Niels, I'll begin with you and I'll ask if you could give us a general explanation of what an acquisitions editor does and doesn't do, as well as an overview of the University of California Press and what it publishes.
Hi, everyone. Hello, that's better. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. I publish amongst other things on the Middle East, on the Gulf, on world history, the Indian Ocean. So it's, you know, we were just talking about this sort of imaginaries of place. It's wonderful to, you know, to be in the place and you get something from that. I think that you don't appreciate from a distance in terms of my own work and publishing and connections and networks. So it's great to be here. An acquisitions editor. So yes, we talked about developmental editing, copy editing, acquisitions editor. There's also a production editor. So there are lots of different people that you would touch with, there will be touch points for you as you publish your book at the press. An acquisitions editor really is the one at the forefront of that goes out and acquires new books. But that's in multiple ways. I go to conferences, countless conferences, coming to workshops like this, meeting scholars, scanning book proposals that come through just by email, every day, and networking. There are lots of scholars that I've worked with that recommend other people. So these are also all avenues that you should use to get your books published. And then we also work with series. So we have academic series, and each series has series editors that also recommend projects and books. So using networks, going to conferences, coming to workshops, it's also a good way to interact with an acquisitions editor. I think the mythology is that, that's all we do. We just sit there looking at new projects, which would be wonderful. I usually end up using my Saturday mornings looking at new projects. The rest of the week, I'm really handling projects that I'm already working on. So books that I'm interested in, that I'm sending out for peer review, books that I'm working, when the peer reviews come back, I'm working with the authors on the revision plans for those books. And then even when they go into production, at UC Press, we call acquisitions editors sponsors. I don't think that's universal at every publisher, but an acquisitions editor is your agent in the press. So we represent you and kind of the shared vision the author and the editor have for the book as it goes through the process, through production, editing, copy editing, marketing, jacket designs, title discussions with sort of point person that those various departments come to until the book comes out. So I would say that 90% of my time is doing that, is sort of representing the book once it's in-house. So I don't have as much time to go through, and this is what we're going to talk about maybe with book proposals, why they have to be short, why they have to sort of say the point really quickly, because we don't have a lot of time to look at the new books. What was your other question?
I asked what you do and don't do. Do people approach you?
Yes, I mean, I think most books, again, perhaps the golden age of publishing was 50 years ago, when acquisitions editors only worked on 10 or 15 books a year and could do the sort of developmental editing that Marissa does. We don't know, no editor really at any house has that time anymore. So we do the big picture editing with you. We pick the peer reviewers, which are really important, because we want, when I send a book out for peer review, I really want it to succeed. So I'm not picking peer reviewers that are going to ding it, that are going to challenge it. I'm picking peer reviews that I think will get it and will move it in the right direction. But then sort of deciphering that and shaping the book based on the peer reviews and my own reading of the book with the author. What we don't do is the sort of chapter by chapter, paragraph by paragraph, or even line editing. We do some big picture sort of structuring of the book, but that's why it's really, I think it's wonderful that Marissa was invited, that you can have a chance to talk to her, because hiring a developmental editor, working with a developmental editor is something that you don't get in-house from an acquisitions editor. Yeah.
And then I think I also asked just what the strengths of UC.
Yeah.
I think it's for people that are online. That's the, I just asked about the strengths of UC Press.
I think, so we're one of the largest American university presses. There's 6 large ones. There's Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Chicago, California, and MIT. We're the only one of those, if you noticed, associated with a public university. So we take our public mission very seriously. We're the only one of those, I think, that sort of has a declared progressive mission. The others would all just say they publish the best scholarship, which we like to say we do too. But we also, our sort of touchword is advancing knowledge, driving change. So we're looking, we're not scared of a public mission that's pushing things forward in good directions. Not every publisher publishes everything. And it's important to realize that when you look for a publisher, we are strong in the humanities and social sciences. Our editors are organized by discipline, but so history, I'm the history editor, anthropology, sociology, and so on, musicology, film studies. But we're all very, and I think this is another strength of UC Press, we're all very interdisciplinary, and we think of shared themes amongst the editors of the press. So Middle East studies, area studies like Latin American studies, Asian studies, Middle East studies, but also environmental studies, gender studies, gender and sexuality, race, immigration. These are all really strong themes across all of the editors' lists. So we all feel like we're contributing to those themes at UC Press. I think in terms of picking a publisher, it's Oxford and Cambridge are huge. There are big corporate publishers. There are trade publishers. UC Press does trade, and by trade I mean books for the general public. We identify our books as commercial trade, academic trade, which is a sort of the cross point between, for scholars who write for wider audiences, scholarly books and then course books. I think there are strengths. Overall we're a sort of mid-sized house, and there are strengths, advantages, and disadvantages to that. At a big house might have a lot of clout, but you might get lost on a very big list. A small house may be able to give you a lot more personal attention, but would they, do they have the clout to get the books out there and the channels to get the books out there in the marketplace? So considering the size of a publisher is helpful as well.
Maybe I'll just stick with you just for one more set of questions. And I think these are kinds of questions that you are very, you're used to talking to. But I just wondered if you could talk to us about the basic stages of the process of publication. And I think if it's able to differentiate between if there are differences if someone's coming with a dissertation versus someone who's coming with a second or third book project.
Yes, so just quickly to demystify the process, because it seems very abstract from far away. Yes, you would encounter an acquisitions editor first. We could talk a bit more later maybe about how to reach an acquisitions editor and establish that sort of contact. But once I'm interested in a book, I always ask authors for their wish list of peer reviewers. You can book that on a book proposal too. I may or may not use them. It has to be an anonymous process. These shouldn't be your best friends, your people in your departments, your mentors at graduate school. They have to be some people with critical distance, but it's helpful for me to see who you think you're speaking to, your sort of wish list of scholars that can give you the kind of advice you need to get this over the finish line. You're also welcome to tell me people you do not want me to send it to, and I won't even ask questions. Hopefully that list is not, massive, because then that would raise questions. But I would respect that, and there are all sorts of reasons, competitive reasons or whatever, that you don't want books to go to somebody. I ask for reviews in 2 months. I'll talk a little bit about the stage at which to come to me with a manuscript. As soon as the reviews come back, I sort of go over them with the author. We identify together what's important. You can resist suggestions that are not pushing the book in the direction that you envisioned for it. And then we come up with a revision plan. But that can happen in a week when the reviews come back. At that point, I can present it to the press for a contract. And the contract would specify when we would want the sort of revised manuscript from you. And that depends on your personal circumstances, your teaching loads, how much time you have to revise, how many revisions are required. It's at that point that you could use a developmental editor if you wanted. And if there are hopefully more and more institutions are providing publication resources that would cover the costs of developmental editing. Other costs are things like indexing to image permissions. It's important to be aware of some of those going through the process. Once a book comes in for production, it's a very tight 8-month schedule to the publication date. It's sort of 6 to 7 months printing and then a month for it to go out to the marketplace and get publicity for the publication date. So if you're working back from a 10-year clock or something, then it's useful to keep those schedules in mind. But there are lots of people that you would work with at a publishing house along the way. Once it's getting ready for production, an editorial assistant that works with the editor would sort of help you prepare it for production. Once it's in production, there's a production editor that assigns the copy editor and the page setter and pushes it through that and organizes the index and the printing schedule. There are marketing and publicity people who, before we put every book in production, so a year to 8 months before the book's published, we have various meetings with our marketing team over the title, over the cover, over what the author's expectations for the book, any ways we can work with the author in marketing the book. So you get a lot of input in that through the process. It shouldn't be intimidating or, it's helpful. We want to team with you and that's the way books succeed. In terms of when to approach an editor, I was saying to a few folk yesterday, when I started 20 years ago, I would just say, send me a manuscript or some chapters. Now I always ask for a book proposal, even if you finish the manuscript. A book proposal, it's helpful for the editor, obviously, but it's helpful for you to crystallize what's most important about your book in a short amount of space. Honestly, if I see very long book proposals, I think that the manuscript itself is going to sort of meander and take 50 pages to get to the point. So the book's proposal sort of forces you to identify the original argument, present it in a compelling and concise way, the sort of elevator pitch, we call it, for the book, an annotated table of contents that shows that you've thought about the structure, a précis about a sort of the audience. A lot of people forget this, the audience that you're writing the book for, and really thinking through that. A section on the landscape of recent books that are out that are related to the topic, but really intended for the same audiences that you're trying to write for. So the book proposal is the most important thing, and it helps me understand that you've really thought about this as a book. But I would accept 2 chapters, sample chapter for a first book, 2 or 3 sample chapters, or a full manuscript. And I really am happy to work with, and I think a lot of editors are like this, to work with authors in the ways that are most productive to you. If you've written a few chapters and want to make sure, and want to get in, in conversation with the press, make sure you have your vision aligned with the publisher, are a little bit stuck about the direction and want sort of confirmation that the way you're moving is right or another way would be better, that would be a good point at which to send in a few chapters to a publisher. And we can offer you a contract on that. We would have to obviously send a final manuscript out for peer review too. If you, but if you're the sort of person that just really wants to write the full manuscript and send it in, that's also great. So yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question that I feel like I've gotten now that I've published a book from people who are still in that the first book process. And I don't know, as an acquisitions editor, how you come down on this, but there at least seems historically to have been the impression that you need to only approach one press. But I think in reality, that is always in the author's benefit, best interest if they have to wait a while to hear from a press. So that's one sort of myth, I guess, that I always hear. I know it, and then I guess I'd be interested, I'm assuming at the point of contract, that's when you need to choose. And the second myth that I think I have also heard, and which was not at all, I did not do this, but is that you need to have networks, you need to have someone introduce you to the press editor. You can't just send a cold email. So I'm just wondering if you could respond to both of those.
No, really good questions. Again, I think 20 years ago, presses insisted on exclusivity a bit more, but the landscape's very competitive, and I think most publishers now accept multiple submissions. It's worth talking to the editor you're talking to, whether they're happy about that. But we certainly do. We consider ourselves a top-tier press, hopefully your first joint choice. So nobody wants to be the backup choice. But if you're really torn between 2 or 3 publishers and you want to see how they respond, submitting them to, I think submitting to 20 publishers, no editor is going to sort of take you seriously, but 2 or 3 is fine. I think once they send a manuscript out for peer review, even before contract, that's when it's sort of worth starting, really narrowing it down. I think at that point, a lot of publishers want to be the only one doing that, but maybe if you're really torn between two, you could do that. But then we're starting to really invest time and effort in your work, and you risk sort of damaging a relationship with an editor if we sort of move through that process and then you say, oh no, I'm going to publish with somebody else. I think once the peer review stage, but at that stage, if you do still want to move ahead with two publishers, I think that's fine as long as you're open with both of them and they both say that's fine. And I do that frequently. The cold calling, you can do that, absolutely. I mean, we get unsolicited submissions all the time. I would say that there's so many of them, and like I say, my time to look at them is so limited that there's, I wish I could get through all of them in a timely way, but it's difficult. And we say on our website to allow us 10 weeks for that, because really we have a lot, which is also why you should probably approach 2 or 3 publishers. I do think it's helpful to use networks because they definitely put the proposal in front of us in a way that just these unsolicited submissions don't. And I wish it wasn't a sort of who you know game, but it is a little bit. But I work with a wide range of scholars over a long time, and if any of them came to me and said, "Oh, my colleague or my friend or somebody I encountered at a conference has this great project, you should take a serious look at that," I will take that seriously. So yeah, using networks is really useful.
Let me move to ask Marissa some questions, and then I have more questions, but also if either of you want to say anything to each other or ask each other questions, please feel free. So Marissa, can you explain what a developmental editor does? What do you do? And when it might be helpful for an author to reach out to you?
Sure. So I will say that there are many different kinds of developmental editors. Basically, what we do is, I will tell you what I think I do as a developmental editor. I will also offer Erin a list of about 50 really outstanding developmental editors who will tell you that they all do different things. Some developmental editors really specialize on book proposal development. Some developmental editors will be your go-to for working on issues of structure and organization, the organization of your evidence, the way that you're carrying your argument through the book, and particularly how you might be dealing with issues of style and tone throughout the manuscript. In my own editorial practice, I tend to work with colleagues who are generally interdisciplinary scholars who might be straddling the world of anthropology and history, or somewhere, or in science and technology studies, or in African studies, or kind of loosely the medical humanities, because that's my background. There are some developmental editors who are less disciplined in their approach and who just work broadly in the sciences and humanities. But I've found that in my own practice, if I don't have some sort of subject matter expertise, or at least kind of a general lay of the scholarly land and where and how you're communicating and what the expectations are for that communication, I'm not going to be helpful to you. So I work with, so that's just kind of like that's kind of like a general overview. What do I do? I read a lot of dissertations and work with a lot of authors who are asking, how do I turn this dissertation into a book? So if I receive a dissertation, I'll take about 6 weeks to read over it, probably about 3 times. I will set up a meeting with the author at various stages of the reading process to ask them maybe a set of like 3 to 5 questions that I have about the project. And I can usually pretty quickly tell if the issue with the dissertation to book process is going to be about structure, or if it's going to be about style, or if it's going to be about argumentation. And then from there, after several conversations with the author, I will write a letter for them that's anywhere from 5 to 15 pages. It ranges so much. And Niels, I'm sure that you've seen just like the wide range of like what feedback, means in these sorts of conversations. And the letter will usually be a summary of the conversations and readings that we've had about the book over the process. And I hope that at the end of the day, the feedback that I've offered provides a useful way forward for thinking about how to transform that dissertation into a working book manuscript that you can then bring to an acquisitions editor. The other part, and then with second book scholars, the work winds up actually being very different. Usually colleagues will come to me with a book proposal and 2 sample chapters. And a lot of the work that we're doing is around being an accountability partner. Colleagues who are already tenured, who maybe don't have kind of like the stick of the tenure review process, or the community, right, that comes with being a graduate, or that comes with being an early career scholar, and like mentoring structures that say, hey, when are we seeing your book? It can be much more difficult to sustain that sort of creative engagement with a writing practice when you have 1,000 of other things to do, including doing, I actually joke that academics write all the time. Like all you're doing is writing. You're writing proposals, you're writing letters of recommendation, you're writing up syllabi, you're writing up lectures. But where do you actually find time for your writing practice? So that's kind of another arena that I work in. And then perhaps the third arena that I work in is I take my role very seriously as an obstacle remover. I find that sometimes we're dealing with, this is going to sound so California and so woo, but oftentimes we're dealing with some sort of serious hang-up or blockage. Maybe we had an encounter with a senior colleague at some conference, and there was like a casual takedown of your book or of your project that's in motion, and you are in paralysis. Maybe there is a family thing going on in the background where you're working on providing care for, either care for a sick parent or going through some sort of major life transition that then makes it really difficult to sit down and give the book adequate care. So I do also see part of my work as being an empathetic partner and saying, what do you need to talk about today in order to get to the book tomorrow? So those are kind of my 3 roles: dissertation to book alchemist, second book proposal reader, and your remover of obstacles in terms of getting back to your practice.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a similar question to Niels, but about your job. And then I thought I would come back and ask the 2 of you the same question and see how you respond. So Marissa, from your vantage point, then, what does the process of rewriting, that's what I want to ask both of you. Sorry. How does one go about approaching developmental editors and hiring them? So we heard from Niels a little bit about how to approach an acquisitions editor. What should one consider if we have that list of 50 wonderful editors? And then you just explained a bit about what kind of relationship you could expect to have with the developmental editor, but I think similar to how I asked Niels what he does and doesn't do, if you could talk about what you don't do as well. And also, I just wondered if you felt comfortable talking about general practices when it comes to process and calculating rates. Sure. Because there's pay here that you don't have, the financial aspect when you're dealing with an acquisitions editor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. So in terms of finding developmental editors, a lot of it, I would say, because many of us are freelance, there are, various databases where you can find lists of who we are. And also I would say that word of mouth, I found that so for whatever reason, different departments have different ongoing relations with developmental editors. The press that you're working with can also give you a set of recommendations, because sometimes there's also a referral process in place. And like I said, I'll offer up a list and some suggestions and resources. Find a person who believes in your project. Seriously, sit down and find somebody who understands what it is that you are trying to do. And that would also be my general advice for working with an acquisitions editor. You want to work with someone who is as enthusiastic and as insightful about your project as you are, and who can see the big picture and the potential and can literally hold this imaginary object in their hands as well, and is excited genuinely about getting you there. So you're not looking for, so look for someone who is more of an intellectual partner than a person who's going to challenge, or look for a person who's challenging, but look for a person who's just not going to shred the whole thing in front of you and then hand it to you and then say, good luck. Because this process is as hard enough as is. It's a lot easier to gestate an elephant than make a book. So you want to work with somebody who gets it and is electrified by it, and who wants to be in conversation with you about the book. What were the other questions?
What do you not do?
What do I not do? I don't do copy editing, and I don't do deep line editing. So I don't read paragraph by paragraph with somebody. I don't do a detailed rewrite of things. And I would say that I also don't take on projects that I don't think I can do well. I've started doing indexing for some colleagues, and I found that you might want to ask developmental editors if they'll do a full package with you, which will also to work as an indexer on it, because the bigger your mental map is of the project in front of you, the easier it's going to be to do the index. So that's also something to think about. And then rates. Okay, so this is labor, and we're working in a scarcity economy, but nevertheless, we all need to eat. So I charge $150 to $300 an hour per consultation. I do that to recognize sliding scale. And so for early career scholars, I'll often say, what's your budget? And then I'll tailor my work accordingly. Packages that I work in range from anywhere to $1,000 to $5,000. Again, how do I determine that? I ask, what is your budget? And what is the bare minimum of what you want to accomplish together? And what is the absolute maximum of what we can accomplish together? And I would just say that strategically, yes, you can work with a developmental editor after you get peer review back. But I would say that especially for first projects, having a person who's going to help you to think about the dissertation to book transition, I think, is actually more useful. That is, if you are a person who is easily paralyzed by feedback, or just will kind of look at something and be just like, that's it, I'm never going to get this done. You might also then want to work with a developmental editor at the peer review juncture.
Can I ask a question too? This isn't less so for first books, for sort of second or third books. Sometimes we will hire a developmental editor if we think we can help the author, an academic author, push to a general market. But sometimes I think about possible different ways of using a developmental editor in that case, either the expensive way of a sort of developmental editing the whole book, or at one end, maybe just getting the assessment and then sharing the assessment with the author and seeing if they can just use that to kind of rewrite it themselves, or getting an assessment and edit of one of the chapters and using that as a model for the rest of the book, which are more sort of budget-friendly ways of doing it. Is that useful? Is that helpful? And I don't even know the answer to that. Is that something you do? And okay.
Absolutely. And I would just say that oftentimes you only just need a push. The author just needs a push. So yeah, rapid assessments, I think, can actually be much more, they're more budget friendly, and also then sometimes there can be too many cooks in the kitchen. So, you know.
Well, I have plenty more questions, but maybe we'll open it up to the audience. And then if we have some silence, I can jump in with another question.
Thank you both so much. Niels, I had a question for you. It's a very simple one. You said it's better to submit a proposal that's concise and so on, but what does that mean? Is that like a page or 2 pages, or is it 5 pages? So just to give us an idea. Thank you.
That's a good question. And I forgot to say it, because the more general question related to that was for second or third books, we can just look at a proposal. If the author, I mean, this is not your question, sorry, but if the author has already proven that they can rewrite a book, the first book, then we can move ahead just on a proposal for a second or third or fourth or whatever book. But for a first book, we need sample writings. For a proposal, yeah, I think, I mean, not 1 page, but the minimum, I have a short book series that's only 35,000 words. It's very unusual. These little, they're almost like pamphlets. For those, I just ask for 3-page proposals. More generally, I'm looking for sort of 5 to 10 pages. Probably not more than 10 pages. Yeah. And I would say just the abstract at the beginning should be really sort of 3 paragraphs, maybe maximum 2 or 3 paragraphs, not 4 of those 10 pages.
I have a question for each one of you. I'll start with you, Niels. Could you please take us through the decision-making process of the choices you make to accept one book and sort of decline the other? Do you have, like, as a publisher, topics or themes or countries? Let's say if you know, for people who work on the Middle East, do you sort of, let's say in year 2023, you need like 20 books on Egypt because they're having something specific. How does it work? Can you take us through the decision-making process behind your choices? And for you, Marissa, I've heard from a few editors when they tell you or tell first sort of for a first book when we're still sort of trying to get our dissertation into a book, so we're still struggling to find your own voice when you write. And I have no clue what that means. Like literally, like I'm on what voice, where, what, what is it? Like, what is that voice that you want me to find? Like I am right where academics were trained to sort of, especially when you just come out of this machine of a PhD, right? You're trained to write in a specific way to prove that that makes a point. But then when you want to transform that into a book, they're like, write with your voice. Which voice? If, I don't know, could you please, there might not be an answer, but if there's a way that you could explain that, maybe both of you, what that means to have a voice.
I mean, Marissa will have a lot more to say on the voice than I do. The 2 little things that I would just say on that first were that you have to unlearn that's the crazy thing about the book writing process. You have to sort of unlearn the PhD process. I think reading, Marissa is much better, you know, to tell you the answer to this. I think reading a lot of books outside the academy, I mean, a lot of places have like serious writing outside the academy, London Review of Books, like New York Review of Books, places like that, looking at that sort of writing style. In proposals, the problem I see a lot is people sort of still hiding behind long quotations, right? Like right at the beginning, or hiding behind other scholars. And what we mean by seeing, there's a lot more to finding your voice, but moving yourself in the front and then using the scholarship to sort of help support you, or a few short quotes maybe, but not this big context setting behind lots of other scholars and then telling me your argument. In terms of subjects, and it's soul destroying being in acquisitions. I mean, it's a fantastic job. It's like my dream job, but I have to say no all the time. There's so much good, many great projects that, that's what, usually when I take a long time to respond to a cold email, it's because I'm sort of gutted. Like I know I can't do it, but I don't want to say no because it's a strong project. The scholarship looks great. I mean, I was going to talk a little bit, and about changes to the publishing landscape over the last sort of 20 years. I mean, this is a big kind of context answer to your question. But when I started, really in the last 20 years, it's been very dramatic, much more than the 20 or 40 years before that. When I started, we would sell 1,000 books to libraries. Now with digital library purchasing options and sharing options, I mean, that went down sort of 10 years ago to 400 to 500 books to libraries. Now it's 100 max, 100 and maybe 200 books to libraries. So we can't publish books just for libraries anymore. Scholarly presses can't publish research monographs just for libraries. Open access is a sort of answer to that, and a good one, and we could talk about that more a bit later. So we have to look for wider markets for the book. Another wider market for the book is course adoption, or used to be course adoptions 20 years ago. When I was a TA at graduate school, we assigned monographs to undergraduates. I don't think that happens. I mean, I don't know how many of you are actually teaching here or on fellows, but do you sign?
It happens here because students still, by and large, have their books, not everyone, but paid for by the university.
Okay. So that's great. But in the US, I mean, it's also student attention spans with social media and stuff. So monographs are assigned less and less, and we can't really publish books for the class, monographs for the classroom anymore. So that's two of the big sort of ways that sort of publishing was supported before 20 years ago, that this really is not around. I mean, people will use a chapter from a book and put it in a course pack or something, but not assign the whole book. So we're really looking for, part of the public is books that speak to a wider, it can be a wider scholarly audience, multiple fields, environmental, if a book is sort of hits environmental studies and gender studies and Middle East studies, it's sort of, I mean, I do think that we're, it's in Middle East studies, I don't want to be the sort of doom and gloom person, but outside sort of big flashpoints, like Gaza right now, but that, hopefully will but it's difficult to sell books and narrow scholarly books in Middle East studies. So I'm looking for ways that I can find larger audiences for those books. So I think environmental studies in the Middle East is a great place to, look at global warming, climate change, the social impacts of that. Things that cross borders in Middle East studies, the Arab revolutions, the Arab Spring, the sort of counter revolutions, Islamic sort of modernity. There's things that are not just country specific often, or things that are country specific, but can be kind of models for looking at, can be sort of informative for a global audience. So the Middle East in the globe kind of thing. One of the reasons I think I'm working with Chris Lowe, who was a fellow here a couple of years ago, who's doing a book on the history of desalination. But that's it's really happening here, but it's also happening in California. It's happening, a lot of places around the world are looking for this as an answer. So this kind of critical history of it is a Middle East studies project, but is interesting to audiences everywhere. So that was, I think, it doesn't disqualify the really important scholarship that's happening, that's more narrow, but as much as you can sort of make your subject relevant to a global audience. I'm looking for Middle East and African history projects that speak to world history audiences as well. I think, I don't know, it's probably not true here, but I think a lot of Middle East studies scholars and Africanists in the US really have to market themselves as world historians for jobs now too. So it's sort of contingent on people speaking to kind of wider audiences. And those, I think that's what, when I'm looking to say yes to a project, it's like it has that kind of hook that makes it a bit bigger than
and maybe I'll just add to that. I mean, when I was working on my book on the Uganda Cancer Institute, oftentimes people were like, Uganda, why? And I think that it took me quite a while to figure out how to speak to kind of a broader kind of global issue that would be legible to Americans, but that would also like speak to the Ugandan situation and to my colleagues in Uganda, where who I definitely wanted. I wanted to make the book as readable in Uganda as it would be for like American university audiences. And that took 5 to 6 years to figure out how to do. It can be slow. But this gorgeous question and this challenging question of how we find our voice, and how you find your voice after the pressure cooker of graduate school, and all of the ways in which that process actually pulls you apart and then asks you to reconstitute yourself in a wildly different way. How do you come back to yourself? Some things that have worked for me: reading, and reading widely, and reading not nonfiction, but reading fiction, and reading fiction from the place that I want to be writing about. Embodied practice. I actually think that the more that we move, I think that this whole body is a research instrument and an artistic instrument and a creative instrument for writing. And some sort of embodiment, whether that's yoga or dance or hiking or swimming, some way in which you can move and think really helps. Journaling and morning pages. I know it's really dorky, but Julia Cameron's like creative recovery program, The Artist Way, yeah, do those morning pages. Like, you don't need to follow her 12 steps, but do the morning pages. They're revolutionary. Just 3 pages in the morning. I find that going and looking at what artists are doing and what artists are creating is really powerful, whether that's going to theater or whether that's like, just having a relationship with photography or just anything that helps you to feel inspired, can be extremely helpful. If you have the resources to go back to your field site, if you did field work, go and talk with people about the work that you did. Bring your work back to the field, make presentations about it. It will help to unstick the stuck. I find that sending voice notes to myself and then transcribing my voice notes is one of the surest ways to find authorly voice when I'm struggling. And then just to bring in the California woo, if you're not seeing a therapist, see a therapist. Like, just go to therapy. If NYU covers it, just go. like, yeah, on the part of the research budget, after these people destroyed you, call the spirit back, but I do think that there is internal work that has to get done as well after that kind of process in order to do external work. And then I guess the last thing, which is less woo, but it's clutch, is that you really do need to identify the thing. the thing that actually compelled you to do this work in the first place, the thing that had you do this for 10 years. You know, you didn't do this for the big bucks. You didn't do this for like, you know, you didn't do this for like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You did this because something was really animating you and driving you. And if you're comfortable, and the thing might be really dark and difficult to deal with, like the thing, my own thing was like, you know, parents' death in my 20s, and that like inspired a whole bunch of things. But if you're not comfortable with the thing, it's going to be really hard to get the writing done. So that's my other suggestion.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Niels.
Jump in again. Sorry. I just piggybacking off that. I think putting yourself in the proposal is because people again hide behind what they've learned in academia and like sort of objective distance from the subject to sound scholarly in the proposal. But it's really helpful for me to understand. I always get this talking to people, but I don't get it in the proposal, like why they did this book. And it could be personal. It could be a parent's death. Or it could be, it doesn't matter. But when I understand why this is important to you, that sort of makes it live for me. And that helps a lot. And sort of piggybacking on that, we also look at what we call author's platform. And that's a scary thing, especially for first books. And you don't have to have a big platform, which is sort of a media presence or whatever for your first book. And you wouldn't have that. But I was reminded about this because of what Marissa was saying about talking to communities, maybe communities of your research, anything that you do to engage with your subjects outside the academy is both helpful, I think, for writing the book, but also for sort of making yourself a voice on these issues. And we want to hear about that. Again, people leave that out of the proposal. If you're an activist, if you work for an NGO, if you do something related to the topic, just engaging with the community that you're writing about or whatever, that also is something that people leave out of book proposals that that I want to hear about and the press is enthusiastic about.
Hi. Sorry, can you hear me? Yep. So actually, this is a follow-up to exactly what you were just talking about, both of you, and to the question of voice. In terms of what you were just describing in kind of public humanities, right? In terms of your general interventions and public writing, you mentioned reading the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books. So I'm wondering, I don't want you to predict the future, but the more recent trends. So you talked about the last 20 years. So, but is there something going on now that would make a more public-facing scholarship, more narrative, more personal, to use the words that you were both using, more acceptable in academic writing? I'm just curious if you, I just came from a session where Natalie was also at, where we were looking at accreditation and things like that. But one of the things that they mentioned was, at least the table I was at, that when you feed monograph chapters to students today, they feed those into AI to get the jargon simplified so they can actually do the reading, right? So I'm just wondering if there are ways in which public humanities and perhaps some of the context that we're in means that people are writing in a more clear way, or is it too soon to say that that's actually crystallized as a trend in academic or crossover or trade publishing that both of you are engaged in?
So are we moving in a more accessibly written direction? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Less jargony and perhaps something which hopefully students or other people might actually want to read without having somebody else summarize it first.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's good advice in general. I do think that maybe the sort of market trends of scholarly publishing have kind of pushed books in that direction. Hopefully tenure departments and promotion departments do consider public humanities work as well as publishing journals and books as part of, I think that we are seeing a trend in that in the US, that there's not just the sort of academic book as the alone as the kind of mantra for moving ahead. And I do see more understanding of public history projects, for instance, as a path for tenure and promotion as well. So these are, I think, all good trends. I think, we are living, I mean, I was talking about the class enrollments and library sales and things. We're also living in a dangerous moment for humanities. There's declining enrollments, declining student interest in history, STEM, this campus probably very much as anywhere. So for history, which is what I mostly work in, to make a case for itself to a wider, to the public, is the way it's going to survive. And so I think there is this sort of, and that's a very recent sort of, but there is a space for jargon-heavy scholarly books. I think that is more increasingly open access, and that's which is great as well. There's sometimes you have to do a theory-driven book. We do generally advise authors to move away from jargon to theoretical jargon, to put people in their books, to put stories in their books, even if there's theory that's sort of informing the argument, obviously, but to make it about people and have narrative-driven books because students will actually read them. Then.
I'd like to share something, actually, and it echoes what Melissa was saying, and it's from my own experience. I'll be very personal on this. Resilience, okay, I think is very important, but also having an audience beyond the immediate peers, or actually not peers, the professors that were immediately surrounding me. And when I was doing a master's, I just finished a master's at the School of Oriental African Studies, and it was 1992, and it was actually a very, very male and very aggressive type of department that I was working in. And sorry to be very personal on this, but I will. But basically, my professor and tutor had invited me without telling me that I was actually giving a speech, right? So it's one of those situations, you walk into a room like this, and then suddenly, there you are, talk about what your research into McCartney and the mission to China was. Okay, so I was already thrown into the deep end. I think what I want to say is that, my research actually was very interesting and has been proven to be true, actually. It was about Joseph Banks and how the mission to China was actually to upend tea plants and bring them to India, which nobody had ever really researched into this area. I happened to just come across some very interesting papers at Kew Gardens. But because it didn't fit in with the milieu of how this particular time was viewing McCartney, it was given no credence whatsoever. And I was, just an M&A student who just kind of wandered in unprepared. So I've kept my curiosity, I've kept my resilience. I've had this actually published by the New York University through Hugh Scogan, who's one of the professors. It's on his history of Chinese history, etc. So and law. So I kind of feel to some degree vindicated. But my point really to this group is that I think I would have probably gone down an academic route. I would have probably enjoyed doing a PhD, but that experience completely destroyed any hope that I had at that particular time. Showed I wasn't resilient, right? But I think resilience is really important. And people with Melissa's job, they weren't around in my day. So,
sorry, my name is Marissa.
Marissa, that's what I thought I said.
I thought I heard a Melissa.
Oh, Marissa.
Yeah,
okay,
Marissa.
My apologies.
Yeah,
my apologies. Okay, so anyway, that's enough from me, but I thought I'd just share that with the group.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question that kind of two questions that I guess are for both of you, actually. I was wondering when we submit sample chapters, what is the most useful for each of you to have as sample chapters? Like, because I guess an introduction, for example, is maybe a bit redundant with a book proposal. So what do you feel is most helpful for you to actually be able to see what kind of book it is and to sort of help take it from there? And I was also wondering, so I'm an anthropologist, and one of the things that I'm struggling with in writing a book proposal is sort of showing this range between the theory and the ethnography in 5 pages, for example. And so I was wondering also how much sort of macro should the book proposal be? Like how much should it give an overview of everything? How much should it actually give sort of samples of the type of data that we are dealing with? And how do you see this distribution, let's say, in a book proposal?
I think it's having the methodology in the book proposal, especially, I mean, maybe less so for history projects, unless you found these amazing new archives and you want to highlight that, or you're covering you've done archival work in, 3 different continents or something. It's definitely worth putting that in. But for anthropology, sociology, I mean, I think having a bit on the methodology is helpful in the book proposal, especially if it's innovative. Sample chapters. If the sort of abstract and then the annotated table of contents in your book proposals really is almost the same as your introduction, then you don't need to submit the introduction. If not, having the introduction is really helpful because it helps. We will, if you're submitting sample chapters, not just for the press feedback, but for me to send out to peer review and get a contract from, sort of orienting the peer reviewers to the scope of the project through the introduction, and the main argument through the introduction actually is useful. Even though once you've finished writing the book, you'll end up rewriting the introduction, definitely. I think the sample chapters, like I think I think there's a struggle between the ones that you think are really well polished and you don't need any advice on, but you will get, you're most likely to get good peer reviews on. And then ones that you're struggling with, but in a way, the most helpful feedback will be the ones that you're struggling with. It's a little, but you don't want to get a negative peer review. So it's sort of treading that fine line is that's not very helpful. But I think that being open to feedback on the sample chapters is really a good thing, and something, if you're looking for feedback that will help make it better, that's what we're trying to do. They should be representative of the tone and writing of the book. If you have some people, I mean, hopefully all the chapters do sort of elevate your voice and argument, but if you have very different kind of methodological chapters, choosing the 1 or 2 that reflect 2 different types of writing in the book is really key, so that you get the most helpful feedback on that as well.
Yeah, I fully agree. I'll say that when you're sending out sample chapters to a developmental editor, I would say send it when you feel stuck. Again, that point of stuckness where you know that you're, usually I can tell when something, usually as a writer, like when it's maybe about 65% done and you don't know how to get it over to that 80% mark. Does everyone know that place that I'm talking about? I would say that you don't want to send a draft where it's so drafty that your editor isn't going to be able to see the structure of it, or that you have large chunks of it missing. Give it a polish. I would say you don't need to be, maybe the comfort level isn't, I'm ready to send this to a journal, but I'd like to be able to send it to a journal, for a first round of review after I get feedback on this draft. That's about where I would say we are useful.
Talking about journal, you keep prompting ideas that I had. If you've had experience submitting articles for journals, I would say the book, but you haven't yet had experience submitting for books. The book process is much more constructive and positive and helpful. Like I have never worked in journals, but we don't. What I've heard from the authors that have said, we don't have the sort of revise and resubmit. We don't have the nitpicking. Most book certainly the peer reviewers that I choose for books are really trying to help the project and get it move it in the right direction and give you the best advice, but not to sort of say, oh no, it's not, it's less critical. I mean, it is critical, but it's less, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but it's definitely a much more constructive process than I think journal.
Yeah, maybe the word I would add would be conversational. Like I've felt that like book writing is like a conversational process rather than a gatekeeping process. I was going to ask, do you think that one thing I tell my authors is that the introduction might be the first thing that you read, but it's often the last thing that you write. Has that been your experience in editing?
The first thing that we read, or yeah.
Often the last thing that actually gets polished.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think yes, you should. Yes. I mean, I will want to see a good introduction initially, but I will also understand, and this goes for the title and the chapter headings and actually a lot of the book. I will expect it all to change. So I will look at it. I won't judge a proposal on the title because I know we will change it, and we will change it in conversation with the author. We won't go with it. I mean, when you get a book contract, it sounds super scary. It's all in the interest of the publisher. It sort of gives us the right to do anything we want with your book, but that would never happen. Actually, we would never, and no publisher would go ahead with a title that the author wasn't thrilled about, or a cover that the author wasn't thrilled about, or we wouldn't make big decisions about the book, even though the contract kind of gives us the right to do that without that change with you. But yes, I mean, these are things to think about in the proposal. The title, the titles of the chapters, how inviting they are, talking about academic jargon, and maybe not keeping them in the chapter titles, unless you just said that this is a book just for scholars. And the introduction will be rewritten completely at the end, but we'll still want to see a good introduction at the start. In terms of titles, shorts, I don't like lists of subtitles. I feel that was very 1990s, like, race, gender, and sexuality in blah, blah, the list of 3. I really like arguments in a subtitle, like how blah, blah, blah made something. But that's just my idiosyncrasies. I don't know.
I have a quick question for either of you. What do you have any advice for like networking advice in terms of meeting? Like, where do you all hang out outside? Where do we go? We know the conferences, but sometimes we have to be selective with conference we go. So, any advice for early career scholars on how to kind of network in that way?
I do think that, I was going to talk about this, also about talking to your communities outside the academy, but also within the academy. Where do people go to find out about work that you're interested in? Like, if you're an environmental studies person, where do you go to find out the coolest new thoughts, ideas, people, books, and environmental studies? That's where we want to hang out. But also it helps you think about, that's your network, right? And when your book comes out, that's going to be your core audience. And knowing those people, knowing where they are, if they write for the Environmental History Journal, but also for, for want of a better one, Orion, which is non-academic environmental studies places, or podcasts, or blogs. I'm not, some editors do scan a lot of the sort of social media stuff. I don't really, but I think those are the networks that will get you connected with an editor. But also, when your book comes out, those are the core people that are going to want to know about it and buy it. So and that was a very vague.
In addition to that, another recommendation that I would have for early career scholars is if you have some access to funds for organizing a conference, that can actually be a great way to build out your network. And especially if you do some of the invitational work and some of the curatorial work and some of the hosting work, there's a way in which it cultivates goodwill, and then it can also be an opportunity to bring in people who might be more challenging to meet. People also love to get cold emails about their work saying, I loved your book. Like writers, we don't hear you. It's like a delight to open up your inbox and to hear from somebody new. So I wouldn't be worried about reaching out to somebody and saying, hey, I just finished this and I loved it. Do you want to set up a Zoom? I'm working on this thing. Like, take advantage of the connectivity that we have post-COVID.
Thank you. This has been really helpful. I have a kind of dissertation to book kind of question. Between the dissertation and the book, when you get approached to publish articles on your work, I feel hesitant to not share chapters or parts of chapters because I want to see it as a book. Do you go and write a fresh article, or does it turn off the editors to know that part of that dissertation has been published in article form?
No. But I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. There's kind of a rule of thumb that I do no more than 2 articles from a book. But really what matters to us, and really to you in the end, is that you don't offer a sort of digest of the whole book in one article. Don't do a kind of preview of the whole book. Because if instructors can assign an article instead of a book, they will. If somebody can read an article instead of a book, they will. So we will really ding the impact of the book if you offer most of the book in one, even in one article. But if you have little discrete kind of research pieces of the book that speak to the larger theme, but are kind of separate from it, you could publish 2 articles from the book. And that adds we think of that as publicity for the book. I mean, people have read this and they want to know more. They want the full thing. And we would love it if the journal, I mean, if you already have a contract with a book publisher and the journal article says forthcoming from such and such from University of California Press, it's advertising for the book. It's great.
Yeah, especially if there's a part of the book or a journal article in there where you think it would be really great for advancing a theoretical argument, or if there's like something that's nested in there that's a gorgeous case study, then I would definitely think about having that be a standalone journal article.
Yeah, I would say on that, just testing your ideas with editorials, with articles, with organizing little workshops, talking about where you, and then also thinking about where you meet editors. You can reach, we do love meeting people at conferences. And setting up an appointment before conferences is way better than just sort of cold calling, because I can read a little abstract of your book, put aside half an hour, and we can have a really good conversation. And it helps to put a face to the name, because I do find out more about the project than just an empty book proposal. But if, again, you're in Abu Dhabi, many of maybe the conferences that I'm talking about are in the US, it might be difficult to get to. You can reach out to editors and say, can we set up a Zoom call? Yeah. If you're interested, if you want that, yeah, you can do that instantly.
Okay, we have one final question. This is coming from online. I'm a historian who enjoys writing narratives based on the evidence found from the archives. Theory is not my strong suit, but I am often asked by editors on what is my theoretical contribution to the field. What's your advice on balancing theory and storytelling?
I mean, I think again, it's worth looking at the publisher. For instance, Duke, I think, do a lot of very heavy theoretical books. We like to think that our theory, if and when we do theory-driven books, they're grounded in archives. So we have a very different approach to theory across the whole UC Press. I mean, I am doing one Gramscian theory book right now, but it's rare for us. I would never ask somebody, what's your theoretical contribution? I would ask, what's your argument? And what's your original argument, and put that right at the front. But yeah, no, I mean, it can be informed by theory, but we'll usually ask people to take heavily theoretical language out and have it sort of hidden, have it there, not dumb down the book, but have it have the book driven by archival narrative storytelling.
Yeah, again, I would say that this whole process is kind of like it's a two-way dialogue. And so if you are a really empirically driven storyteller, you'll want to find a press and an editor who likes that and welcomes that, and again, isn't going to say, we want this to be something that it is not. So I guess my final advice would be, again, find somebody who really wants, find a press that is also creating books that are already in line with your vision and kind of how you work as a knowledge producer, rather than trying to shoehorn yourself into a press that just has a different orientation to what a list is and to what knowledge production is.
You know, again, you prompted another idea, but going back to what Marissa said earlier, the intellectual partnership with an editor is really key. We are your advocate at the press, and so that's where having a Zoom call, you know, is helpful, because you're interviewing us as much as we're interviewing you, and you want to hear that we get why you're excited about the book, and we can kind of represent it. Oh, and in terms of lists and presses, they change. So if a press 30 years ago, we were really good in French Revolutionary history, we don't do it at all anymore. So don't look at books from 20 years ago. Look at the books that the publisher's done in the last 5 years as the direction that they're moving in now.
Thank you, both of you. It's 2 p.m., so I'm going to stop this, but thank you so much for sharing all your expertise and experience and insight. I hope this was helpful to everyone at different stages of writing and publishing. Can I say that people can reach out to you? Okay.
The only problem with California and Abu Dhabi will be finding a time.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Niels. Thank you so much, Marissa.